March 6, 1944, 27,000 feet over the Havel haze west of Berlin, the sky was a hard, burning blue cut by the straight white scars of contrails, cold bit like a blade. The B-17s came in box on box, aluminum cities moving at 150 knots. Prop tips scything the thin air as the Norden sights waited for the initial point. They looked unstoppable. Below and ahead, Berlin's flak belts woke in stacked tiers, the 8.8 cm's guns punching black blossoms into the path of the raid, as if planting a garden of steel. Every blossom meant death. The Luftwaffe had climbed early from Werneuchen and Oranienburg, yellow-nosed Bf Unod 9Gs and barrel, chested Fovlu 900As coiling above the spree like hawks riding thermals. They were hungry. They had counted miles and fuel and precedent. Certain the escorts would peel away before the capital. Certain the bombers would be theirs in the last stretch. They had reasons to believe. The Mustangs didn't turn. Disbelief cracked. P-51Bs, sleek, lean, 37 feet of promise, slid along the high flank like drawn sabres. Their paper 108-gallon tanks sucked dry and jettisoned to tumble end over end into the haze. Resolve flashed silver. In the cockpits, the Packard-built Merlin V-1650s breathed thin oxygen through two stage superchargers, a high, feline whine riding over the coarse prop thunder as the needles steadied at 700 RPM and 46 inches. The machine sounded alive. Bandits. 2 o'clock high. Tolly. Ho. The radio snapped. British cadence carried by an American group that had learned its trade at Debden and Bodney and Leiston. The hunt began. The lead element of 4th Fighter Group rolled its red noses into the sun, while the Yoxford boys of the 357th split to cover the high box, wings flashing as they tightened fingertip formation. Angles became weapons. A German swarm dropped from contrails, the leader's 109G6 heavy with gun pods. Its cannon burp smudging the blue as he lined up a fortress in the high right echelon. He expected an easy kill. The gun camera on a Mustang's right-wing root began to wear as the pilot took a half-second snapshot and closed. His K-14 sighter pale ring around a dark cross. Instinct took over. Drop tanks away. Let's go to work. Crackled a calm American voice, clipped and almost bored, as two 50 cal belts, API-AP tracer, spooled forward in shimmering brass. Fury followed. A German wingman broke hard left. The black crosses tilting, the canopy flashing. But the Mustang stayed, the long laminar wing holding the bite as it carved a descending, accelerating arc. Surprise bled into panic. The bomber interphone whispered, and then shouted, "Little friends," 12 high, and gloved hands in vibrating turrets went slack for a heartbeat at the impossible sight. Fighters still there, over Berlin, hope felt like oxygen below. The Havel lakes glittered like shattered mirrors, and the city's smoke began to lie in grey bands as the first bombs walked into marshalling yards and factories. The earth answered the sky. Inside the Luftwaffe radios, orders curdled into exclamation, "Nicht steigen, Jetstangreifen," as staff and leaders tried to force head on strikes before the Mustangs could cut across. Timing slipped away. On the American side, another voice, steadier now, marked the instant in ink for history. Engaged 15 plus EKA at 27 Zalausen, vicinity of Berlin, fired 2 second burst from 200 yards, observed strikes, E-to-A rolled inverted and went down smoking. Paper captured shock. Hermann Guy Ring would later put it in one sentence. "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the war was lost." Arrogance met reality. The Packard, Merlin sang at altitude where earlier Allison engines had gasped. The Mustangs riding their range on resin, impregnated, paper, tanks and careful mixture, the needle swinging between lean and rich like a conductor's baton. Endurance became a weapon. Gun camera film blinked and stuttered, catching a 109's canopy sailing free and a pilot tumbling into the white, a speck swallowed by his own contrail. Mortality had a shape, through the canopy frost. A Mustang pilot watched a dark cross grow huge and then vanish in a burst of fuel and magnesium. The smell of cordite and heated oil clawing under his mask even at 30 below. War smelled metallic. Below, a bomber navigator sketched the zigzag of a river between flak bursts and scribbled a line in his log. Escorted to target. It read like a miracle. The bombers held course over the capital. The Mustangs spread wide like outriders on a metal herd, and over Brandenburg the contrails tangled into white braids that marked a new geometry of power. The sky changed rulers. What began as another proud rush to defend, the Reich shifted in the thin, merciless air as the range of an engine, and the resolve of its pilots erased the last safe sanctuary. And, on that cold blue noon, the Luftwaffe feared nothing, until the P-51 stayed to Berlin. By late 1943, the combined bomber offensive had a map-wide rhythm. RAF heavies carving blackened cities by night, while the 8th Air Force drilled daylight holes through Germany's vital organs. 2 strategies, 1 pressure. American doctrine hinged on self, defending formations, box stacked upon box. A forest of 50 caliber guns meant to stitch a wall no fighter could cross as Norden bomb sites picked ball, bearing plants and aircraft works. Belief met physics. The Luftwaffe studied the bomber stream from radar plots and contrails, assembling intercepts in waves guided by W. Rasberg and Freya, head-on attacks from Bf 109G6 and F-Aduline Dindonase, followed by slashing tail passes from twin-engined Zersterer. They wrote a timetable of killing. Heavy weapons multiplied on German wings, 20 mm MG Footfee 120 pods under Messerschmitts, 30 mm Mk1 spitting short, brutal bursts. 21 cm Dugia 21 rockets lofted from Focke-Wulfs to break the boxes before closing for the finish. Firepower favoured the defender no longer. On the 17th of August 1943, Schweinfurt-Regensburg proved the arithmetic cruel, with 60 B-17s failing to return out of 376 dispatched, and crews counting empty bunks by the dozens. Morale bled at mess tables. On the 14th of October 1943, Black Thursday, the second Schweinfurt raid cost another 60 flying fortresses from 291 cent, despite grim determination and gunners firing until barrels glowed. Conviction met attrition. Allied fighters could not stay the distance. Spitfires were thoroughbreds on a short leash. P-47 Thunderbolts roared to mid-Germany and had to turn back. And even the long-legged P-38 Lightnings struggled with cold, weather reliability at high altitude over the Reich. The last 100 miles belonged to the enemy. The Luftwaffe's day fighter leaders built their confidence on that retreat point, stacking Staffeln to pounce once the escorts peeled away, and measuring fuel to the minute for the slaughter window. They trusted the clock. American planners read the ledger and shifted the aim. The point-blank directive elevating the German fighter force itself to primary target, and setting machine tools and aircraft plants as the bait. Strategy stiffened. February 20-5, 1944, big week, unleashed massive raids on Leipzig, Gotha, Augsburg and Regensburg, forcing the Jagdwaffe into the thin air, where its best could be blood. A trap sprung in daylight. But the trap needed teeth that could stay, and the Mustang B and C arrived with a new promise Packard, built Merlin VDO 1650 engines and laminar, flow wings that drank distance as much as sky. Range became doctrine. Internal fuel near 184 gallons, coupled with twin 108-gallon pressed paper drop tanks gave an escort radius that reached beyond the Oder, and careful mixtures and cruise settings stretched every mile. Endurance rewrote tactics. The RAF had first proven the airframe's grace at low altitude with Allison-powered Mustangs, but only the two-stage, two-speed supercharged Merlin let the fighter breathe comfortably above 25,000 feet where the bombers lived. Height married speed. Industry met intellect at the radiator, where the Mustang's Meredith effect duct turned heat into a hint of thrust. and drag fell away along that clean laminar wing that sliced the slipstream like a scythe. Efficiency wore a fuselage. On the other side, German engineers answered with more sting, beforehand carrying 30mm cannons and even BK 550mm guns to reach into formations from beyond, 50 range, and tactics that emphasized head on passes that gave gunners only a heartbeat to react. They counted on shock. Radar controllers watched the streams on cathode green scopes and funneled JG1, JG11, JG3, and JG26 by height and quadrant, while flak divisions stacked black bursts under the Rendezvous altitudes. The sky became a machine. Yet leadership mattered as much as metal. And in January 1944, Jimmy Doolittle took command of the 8th Air Force, issuing a clear mandate that unshackled escorts from tight bomber leashes. Purpose sharpened. Seek out and destroy the German Air Force wherever you find it, in the air and on the ground. He directed, sending fighters ahead, above and outside the stream to break the ambush before it formed. Offense replaced escort. On the fields of Debden, Leiston, Bodney, Boxted, and beyond, groups traded thunderbolts and lightnings for Mustangs and rehearsed new moves, upwind sweeps over assembly areas, high cover above the initial point, slashing dives to scatter forming shore rom. Practice promised survival. In briefing Huts bombers, still traced bomb runs with grease pencils across maps punctured by tacks. But the timing notes changed as escorts were scheduled not to leave, but to overlap and hand off, squadron, to the edge of Berlin and home again. Continuity replaced cliff, edge. German pilots, veterans of France and the East, still launched with pride. But their calculus of fuel and fear assumed the old curtain call, and their commanders wagered that American bravado would end at the capital's flak belt. They misread the horizon. The stakes were not just factories and rail yards, but the very air over Europe. For if the bomber stream could cross Germany under a steel canopy, the Reich's fighter arm would be blind white, and the ground war's future decided. Air power sought decision. Between claim and counterclaim, the unforgiving sky waited with a single testee. Could the escorts stay to the target, fight there, and still bring the bombers home? Berlin would answer. The P-51 B-C looked like a drawn arrow, its laminar, flow wing and razorback spine carving a crease in the air that stayed smooth when others began to howl. It was built to run. Inside the cowl, the Packard-built Merlin VI 1650-3i7 turned two-stage, two-speed supercharger gears that stacked pressure in thin air, keeping manifold needles honest above 25,000 feet where bombers lived. The engine breathed thin fire. At altitude the numbers told their own promise. About 440 miles per hour near 25,000 feet, over 41,000 feet of ceiling, and the climb to meet contrails measured in minutes, not miles. Speed became sanctuary. Fuel was the secret that made Berlin possible, and it was carried like a campaign plan, wing tanks of roughly 184 gallons inside early Big C airframes, often augmented in 1944 by an 859-gallon fuselage tank behind the pilot, and twin 180-gallon paper drop tanks slung under the wings. Range turned into reach. Those drop tanks were phenolic, impregnated cardboard, cheap to make, light to carry, and meant to be discarded the second a fight began. Their seams sweating fuel in the cold before tumbling end over end into cloud. Expendables bought survival. Pilots nursed mixtures to economy, 400 rpm, and lean settings on the step of the supercharger, then shoved throttles to 46 inches or more when the intercept flared, trading gallons for seconds in a sky where timing was life. Discipline managed distance. The radiator scoop under the belly was not a drag penalty, but a quiet ally. Its Meredith, effect duct, turning waste heat into thrust recovery so efficient that at speed the Mustang's cooling cost nearly paid for itself. Heat became help. Up front a Hamilton standard hydromatic propeller, over 11 feet of constant speed bite, translated Merlin torque into smooth, gripped air, the blade tips scything a steady drumbeat through the headset hiss. Power felt taut. Guns were honest and American 4.52 caliber Browning M2s in the BTPC with ones 2 to 60 rounds, later 6 on the D, firing a harsh recipe of API-AP, and tracer that walked into coolant and cockpit from 200 yards. Fire spoke plainly. In the BWC, the outboard guns could be finicky until feed chutes were re-angled and harmonization drilled into crews, but when the belts ran, the Mustang's gun camera showed strikes that looked like a zipper pulled through aluminum. Mechanics earned every kill. The cockpit was workmanlike. N9 reflector sight in early 1944. Later, the KO-14 gyro ring that made deflection less guesswork. And everything fell to hand behind armoured glass that frosted at altitude like thin ice. Visibility meant choice. Approached from high 6, opened fire at 250 yards, slight deflection, observed strikes on left wing root and canopy. EGA rolled and went straight down. Reads a 6 MAR 44 combat report from a Mustang group that had never been that far with bombers before. Paper preserved the moment. Doctrine gave the machine a soul, and in January 1944, Jimmy Doolittle unhooked that soul from the bomber stream with a single mandate: find the German fighter arm and kill it. On the climb, over the target, and on the ground, mission turned to hunt. Finger 4 formation stacked by altitude, low cover to scythe off head on attacks, high cover to pounce on top, cover shore ram, free rovers pushed out ahead to spoil assemblies at Rendezvous beacons, tracked by Freya and W. Rasberg. Angles replaced walls. Escort became choreography instead of tether, with overlapping handoffs from Debden to Leiston to Bodney and back. Squadrons timing fuel ticks and altitudes to arrive early over the ambush points the Jagdgeschwader trusted. Timing killed ambush. The Mustang's character fit that script high-altitude comfort where the F-192A's BMW 801 gasped, deep legs where the BF-109G's slim tanks ran dry, and a dive that held together so cleanly the horizon seemed to hinge on its spinner. Superiority felt effortless. German pilots tried heavier punches, Mk-130 mm bursts that shredded fortresses, Me-410s with BK-5 cannons firing from outside. 50 range, but the price was wait and climb, and the Mustang feasted on the lag between passes. Momentum punished mass. Even at the target the bastards were there. A Jagdwerf diary groans in early 1944, noting strafing attacks on airfields as formations tried to refuel for the afternoon sorties. Persistence bred fear. The Mustang had vices. Fuel sloshing in the new fuselage tank made the B-2C squirrely in yaw until pilots burned it down first, and at 30 below oil creaked and hands numbed despite heated gloves, but its strengths matched the war's geometry. Trade-offs were accepted. In maintenance tents, sheet metal men kept the laminar wing surface flush with putty and polish, because roughness cost knots, while crew chiefs blood the coolant lines and set plug gaps to keep the Merlin's voice clean at contrail height. Finish made speed. Every cue aligned. The engine that didn't choke at 30,000, the wing that kept its promise in a dive, the fuel that lasted past the capital, and a doctrine that told its pilots not to escort, but to dominate. Character became destiny. And so the Mustang entered the stream not as ornament, but as intent, the kind of intent that carried bombers to Berlin and then stayed unblinking for the fight. The machines will match the mission. March 6, 1944, 27,000 feet, 10 miles west of Berlin, the bomber stream levelled on course as flak flowers opened ahead like black iron roses. The air tasted of ice and cordet. A swarm of Bf 109G6 pitched down through the contrails, their underwing gun pods hanging like clenched fists. Leader lined up on the high, right box of B-17s. They were certain the escorts had gone. The Mustangs were still there, red-nosed from Debden, checkered from Leiston, curled along the sun line with empty paper tanks spinning away into blue. Certainty cracked. Drop tanks away. Tally-ho. 2 o'clock high. Snapped the radio, a clipped calm that cut through engine roar as throttles went to 46 inches and props bit hard. A hunt began. A PL-51B eased its nose under a contrail, the NI-9 sights pale ring framing the 109's canopy, and the pilot felt the Merlin's 2-stage supercharger wind up like a taut wire. The machine wanted blood. Below. A Fortress tail gunner's voice jumped the interphone. Little friends. 12 high. Don't leave us. As tracers stitched past his turret like fiery sewing needles. Hope clung to altitude. The Mustang slid into a shallow dive to build the last 10 knots. The laminar wing holding its bite as the target grew from a cross to a cockpit, frost spidering at the canopy's edge. Time narrowed to a heartbeat. Opened fire from 200 yards, slight deflection. Observed heavy strikes on wing root and cockpit. EQA rolled over and went straight down. Reads a combat report filed that afternoon by a Mustang group, now fighting over the enemy's capital. Paper caught the shock. The 109's radiator burst in a white curtain, coolant fogging into the slipstream as the pilot punched his hood and tumbled into the cold, a dark figure against a sky of chalk lines. Mortality had edges. A second pair of Fu-19 bored in, WW2 rocket tubes fat with intimidation, but their climb was slow with weight, and the Mustangs met them at the apex, firing short, brutal bursts that chewed fabric and fuel. Momentum punished arrogance. Bandits breaking through. Engaging now. Another voice, flat as a metronome, reported as the lead element flipped into the sun and came down in a scything high. Side pass that turned geometry into weapon. Angles decided fates. One Fu-190 wagged, then snapped its radial coughing smoke, and rolled into a ragged splits that ended in a grey smear beyond the Havel Lakes. Terror left a trail. The bombers held course. Wing tip steady despite the hammering, and a navigator marked the spree on his chart with a pencil that shook less now. Writing a line he had never dared write. Escorted over target. Relief sounded like breath. Find Ger mit Langstrecken B. Ltern Mustangs über Zilgebiet. A flustered German controller's fragment crackled in intercepted notes. The words stumbling over their own meaning enemy fighters with long, range tanks, Mustangs over the target area. Disbelief found a frequency. The Mustang pilot glanced down past the gun sight to watch bombs begin their lazy, terrible fall. The marshalling yards below already smudged with smoke, and he trimmed a touch of right rudder to steady the pipper on another climbing speck. Control felt like destiny. He fired a 1 2 burst. API-AP. And tracer walking in a bright zipper. And the gun camera's flicker caught panels peeling off, a figure slamming forward against harness before the fighter corkscrewed into contrails. Finality came fast. Inside a B-17. A top turret gunner laughed once, a raw, unbelieving sound, and then said into his throat mic, "They're still with us." Over Big B. A myth shattered mid-sentence. The Luftwaffe pressed head on again. Tight formations turning cannon fire into shock, but each pass found Mustangs sliding across the path, breaking timing, forcing defensive rolls that bled speed and resolve. The ambush clock broke. A 357th Group section roved out ahead, just as Doolittle's mandate allowed, and they found a staffel forming near a beacon, shots scattering the circle before it hardened, the assembly unravelling like twine in prop wash. Preparation died in the cradle. The radio filled with the unemotional poetry of combat reports. Engaged 1920 IEA at 27,000, fired 2 bursts from 252 observed strikes. E to A smoking broke, do flak. Each phrase obeyed on a new rosary of long-range escort. Language became evidence. On the ground ringing Berlin. Crews pivoted 8-point AS and rolled more shells forward, but flak could not swat the change that had climbed into their sky and refused to leave. Power settled in. By the time the bombers turned off the IP, the white braids of contrails told a story anyone could read. The fighters had come the whole way, and they were still fighting where the gunners had always stood alone. A boundary vanished. Hermann Guillaume Ring would later give voice to the realization no pilot wanted to say first. When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the war was lost. Denial ran out of air. The fighters formed again, oil smelling sweet, burnt in masks and gloves numbed by altitude, and they set course for home with empty tanks and full-gun camera reels that would be threaded through intelligence projectors before dusk. Proof hummed on celluloid. What was supposed to be the safe last stretch became the killing ground for the wrong side, and the first day the P-51 stayed to Berlin wrote the end of an illusion in smoke across a cold blue sky. Arrogance met reality at contrail height. The first escort to Berlin did not close a chapter. It opened a season, and the bombers went back again, and again through March and April while the contrails tightened into white ropes over the Reich. Repetition bred dread. Losses still bit. Nearly 70 fortresses failed to return on March 6 alone, and every missing bomber wrote a cold line in the ledger that demanded more pressure, not less cost-sharpened resolve. Jimmy Doolittle's directive hardened into habit. Your primary job is to go after the German fighters. And groups pushed far ahead of the streams, prowling assembly beacons and climb corridors where radar plots promised prey. Escort turned into hunt. Combat reports thickened with a new rhythm, swept ahead of bombers, bounced 8-10 eager forming, fired 2 short bursts, observed 1 explode, 2 smoking, broke due flak. Predators learned routes. The Jagdwaffe answered with armour and doctrine, building Sturmgruppen, IV Sturm JG3 and Kin, flying F2Y9-A 6-A8 Sturmbock, variants with slabbered-up plates, bulletproof windscreens, and Mk108 30mm cannons to hammer Bu-17s from dead Aston. Weight became a weapon. They attacked inside 50 meters, where tracers looked like a molten fence, and a fortress could fill your windscreen. Some swore not to break until their guns were empty, or their wings were gone. Courage met desperation. Gefechtsverb and formed. Armoured Focke-Wulfs for the kill. Bf-109 top cover to keep Mustangs off. And controllers tried to stack the timing so the hammer would fall before the escorts could cut across. The ambush grew teeth. But the Mustang's range and freedom bled the trap from the edges, rovers knifing down from the sun to scatter forming circles, while high cover slid like a guillotine over any staffel that dared climb alone. Edges collapsed first. Mustangs über Platz! Jabos! Jabos! Crackled field radios as silver fighters materialized over refueling strips at midday, guns walking down parked rows and fuel Bowsers. The gun camera film later unspooling flames in jittery frames. Safety lost its hours. On the engineering pads, the P-51 evolved in step with its mission. The Deaky model arriving with a full bubble canopy, 6 M2 Brownings and roughly 1 880 rounds, and a broader, Cord Hamilton standard prop that bit cleanly at altitude. Visibility became power. The dorsal fin fillet grew onto later Ds to tame the yaw that came with the big fuselage tank, and pilots learned to burn that tank first before twisting hard into a fight. Stability followed wisdom. Higher octane fuel and war emergency boosts pushed manifold pressure into the high 60s and beyond in some groups, giving short, savage climbs and quicker time to intercept above the bomber stream. Reserve turned to burst. By late 1944, the KR-14 gyro sight replaced guesswork with lead computing grace, a pale ring that settled where deflection had once been prayer, and snapshots turned into certainties at crossing angles. Technology steadied hands. Germany kept adding punch. Mi-40-10s with BK-550mm cannons firing from standoff range. Bf-109G per 6 U-4s with snub-nosed Mk-118s for head-on slaughters. But every kilogram nailed to a wing root took a toll in climb and turn. Firepower taxed time. Pilots felt it first. Fear followed function. Approached 2 Hubba 190s attacking tail of high box, fired 1 second burst. Observed strikes and IKA disintegrated. Reads a terse entry from a spring 1944 Mustang report, matter of fact and final. Death sounded routine. On the other side, diaries turned inward. Start in Wellen. Mustangs even Übersilgebiet. Verlust Showa. Notes clipped and grey. Written after sorties where veterans came home alone and novices did not come at all. Experience met exhaustion. The Luftwaffe tried rockets to break the boxes. WGK-21 warheads arsing up like slow fists. But the arcs telegraphed intent, and Mustangs dove to punish the moment between rocket smoke and the turn. Indecision drew fire. American groups learned to sweep airfields after the bomb run, throttling down the lanes of grass and concrete at treetop height. 50s chewing into dispersal huts and camouflaged revetments while flak hissed up in angry, chaotic fans. Dominance found the ground. Straft Ardet Gardeligen destroyed 3x Ego on ground, large fire in fuel dump, received light 20 Milo. Another tidy line recorded, as if the words could hide the smell of hot oil and cut grass under the canopy. Paper hid the heat. By May and June the raids no longer felt like isolated thrusts but like tides, with Berlin, Merseburg, Leipzig, and the synthetic fuel plants at Luna and Brex appearing again and again on the grease, pencil boards. Repetition broke systems. German Staffel leaders briefed, Sturm. Passes and emergency ramming if necessary, but the calculus grew cruel. Each loss was irreplaceable. Each replacement greener, and each mission met by Mustangs that did not leave at the city limits. Hope thinned with octane. Aces still struck, names like Barkhorn, Rawl, and doll-carved victories in the high cold. But their victories no longer shifted the sky, and every climb was a wager against a horizon that now hid fast, long-legged enemies. Mastery became survival. Ground troops coined a nervous phrase, Jabba fever, for the twitch that came when a shadow skimmed a hedgerow at noon, because fighters with bombs and rockets had stolen the daylight from roads and rail lines. Daylight turned hostile. In the ready huts from Debden to Bodny the briefings grew simpler sweep. Here, break this assembly, cover the IP, then hit their fields. In the revetments the crew chiefs wiped oil from silver skins that would be black and cordity burned by evening. Routine wore steel. The interval between arrogance and reality had collapsed, and now the Luftwaffe adapted with armour and audacity while the Mustang answered with reach. Rhythm, and an unsleeping presence over every critical point on the map. Adaptation bred fear. June 6, 1944, dawn over the channel lay cold and low. The light smeared silver on waves while Mustangs in fresh black and white invasion stripes prowled in layered orbits above the armada. The horizon felt owned. The 352nd is blue. Nosed flights held top cover as landing craft shouldered toward Omaha and Utah, with other P-51 groups sliding a guardrail up the Cotentin and down to the Seine as the first paratroopers' parachutes sagged into hedgerows. Protection became presence. Over beaches as 0615 visibility 6008, no flak patrolled between St. Lo and Caen engaged 3 acre, 2 destroyed. Reads a terse fighter report from that morning, written like a checklist and filed like a promise kept. Calm hid awe. Allied air forces flew over 14,000 sorties that day. Fighters, fighter bombers, medium and heavy bombers, while the Luftwaffe managed only a few hundred. Their rare appearances like splinters in a sea of aluminum and noise. The balance was brutal. Joseph Priller's brief, strafing dash with Heinz Wodarczyk Over the beaches became legend precisely because it was so solitary, a defiant streak crossing a sky layered with Mustangs, Thunderbolts, and Spitfires. Courage met a wall. The P-51s circled high to swat intruders, and then dropped to hunt roads and rails. I-50s pricking lines of trucks beyond the bocage and leaving oily scars that ran the length of Norman lanes. Movement learned to crawl. Attacked locomotive north of Argenton. Engine exploded, cars ablaze, light flak encountered. Another combat form recorded with the same unshaken cadence, as if the ink itself had been trained. Routine ate distance. In the days that followed, air power turned mathematical. Bridges cut, yards cratered. Sorties stacked, while the Mustang's Reach stitched a canopy from Brittany to the Seine and back to the Channel, before the fuel gauges whispered home. Numbers built dominance. Jebberfaber spread along German columns. J-Boss! J-Boss! A reflex more than a phrase. Men diving for ditches at the first engine note and flinging tarps over guns that would not fire in time. Daylight became a threat. At 10,000 feet the P-51 could loiter, then stoop like a hawk, 500-pound bombs settling under its laminar wing, or long bursts of API walking bright through canvas and cabs, while the KO-14 sight turned crossing shots into calculations. Precision felt cold. The Luftwaffe tried to contest the beachhead with FW-190s and Bf-109s clawing through weather, but radar screens and roving cover bled each attempt before it formed, and the few that broke through met Mustangs, already turning into firing lines. Attempts unravelled. Engaged 6-8 Eager near Caen at 19,000, destroyed 3 in 2 passes, broke due fuel. Another late day entry notes. One line among hundreds in June as the fighter wore shifted from points to patterns. Patterns killed margins. Behind the beaches the transportation plan paid out in wreckage. Yards at Aulnoy, Tours, and ruin chewed into gridwork. Rails warped. Bridges folded into rivers, while P-51s flew armed Rexes farther inland, hitting locomotives, fuel convoys, and columns trying to reach the front by daylight. Logistics starved in public. Mustangs were not alone. Thunderbolts took the brunt of close air support. Typhoons dove with rockets, but the P-51's range meant no edge of the fight lay beyond its orbit, and its speed made reprisal a rumour. Every road had eyes. The human cost threaded up through that altitude, a pilot's mask smelling of hot oil and cordite, a ground column's panic scribbled in skid marks and burned rubber where trucks jackknifed into hedges under the bright hiss of 50s. Terror left texture. By late summer the rhythm had hardened morning sweeps to break assemblies, midday beachhead umbrellas, afternoon runs to strafe airfields and crash refueling cycles, each action multiplied by groups that now counted Mustangs by the hundreds. Scale crushed resistance. Over fillets the air felt like a foundry. The pocket hammered from above, while columns tried to squeeze through Orne bridges, or slip the dives by dusk, and gun camera film turned fleeing silhouettes into stark arithmetic. Escape became theory. Destroyed 2x Eagle on ground, set 3 trucks afire, light 20 mm from hedgerow, minor damage to right wing. A 352nd pilot wrote in August, understated as a bank ledger and twice as relentless. Detachment masked strain. Strategically, the long Escort put steel exactly where the war needed it. Oil, ball bearings, aircraft works. So Leuna, Merseburg, and Politz found themselves visited not once but relentlessly, bombers arriving with fighter screens still intact over the target. Pressure found arteries. Each raid tightened the loop, fewer trained German pilots, less fuel for those who remained, more Allied aircraft filling the sky with a hum that seeped into villages and command posts alike until it felt like weather. Inevitability took shape. For the Luftwaffe, the calculus inverted. To climb was to be seen was to be bounced was to be lost. and to be lost was to leave a gap that no reserve could fill fast enough. Choice thin to risk. Mustang groups paid in kind. Air war never leaves with clean hands. And names etched onto walls at Leiston, and Debden tell of engines that coughed over the channel and flak that stitched metal in ways no checklist could heal. Dominance had a price. Yet by autumn the sky itself had changed character, a domain patrolled rather than contested, where bombers could run timed lines into the heart of industry, while roving P-51s orphaned ambushes and turned airfields into traps. Ownership felt real. The Luftwaffe had once ruled by timing and courage, but under the wide, unforgiving canopy of 1944, the Mustangs made time their ally and courage their starting line, and the fear ran in the other direction whenever contrails braided above the target. The sky belonged to them. Inglewood and Dallas ran under bright arc lights. Rows of Mustangs sliding on dollies past jigged fixtures as women with bucking bars and men with torque wrenches pinned laminar wings to spines of riveted alloy. Production sounded like rain on tin. North American Aviation turned out Mustangs by the thousands. Over 15 Zollosend in all variants by war's end, with more than 7 900 P-51D and one 500 P-51K alone, while acceptance teams stamped paperwork and pushed the next airframe forward. Scale became tempo. In Detroit, Packard built Merlin engines on moving lines, precision grinding crankshafts and blue-printing supercharger cases until over 55,000 American Merlins were ready for crates stamped VU 1650. Power came in wooden boxes. 1-ton 8-gallon paper. Tanks poured from tire and rubber companies. Phenolic-impregnated shells stacked like wash tubs in rail cars bound for East Anglia, each one a disposable promise of another 150 miles. Range was manufactured crates of 15-rood caliber belts, APIAP, and tracer, moved through ordnance depots by the millions of rounds as armourers in muddy dispersals fed them into Browning receivers until the feed trays clicked shut. Fire was a supply chain. Burtonwood and other USAAF depots in Britain became cities of parts, engine stands, props, radios, and gyro sites arrayed in aisles longer than runways, while air service groups swapped Merlins and patched skins in shifts that forgot midnight. Maintenance smelled of solvent. Tankers unloaded 103 of grade Avgas by the shipload into British storage. Railcars shunted it across to fighter fields in Suffolk and Norfolk, and by late 1944 select units drew 1/5 Hode, grade to push boost into the red for short. Violent climbs. Fuel turned time into altitude. Stateside, the Army Air Forces Training Command pulsed with cadets, primary through advanced. Link trainers humming beside PT-17s and AT-6, while gunnery ranges stitched the sky over Gulf beaches. Replacements were an assembly line. American pilots often reached combat with 200 to 300 hours in type. German replacements came with far less by 1944 as fuel vanished and syllabi shrank, sometimes barely over 100 hours before first contact. Experience became a weapon. Monsieur Verlusten Erfuranen signed Anna Setzlich, 1 Jagdwaffe entry-laments in the summer of 1944. Our losses of the experienced are irreplaceable, and the line reads like a knell beside rosters filled with fresh names. We lose one, it's gone forever. Albert Speer wrote what the hangars already knew. The real importance of the air war consisted in the fact that it opened a second front long before D-Day. His admission running cold across pages meant for defence. Industry felt the verdict. Germany's factories actually increased fighter output in 1944, often surpassing 2,000 monthly and peaking higher. Yet the equation failed for want of high-octane fuel and time to season the boys who strapped in. Quantity met a wall. On the continent after June, PLUTO lines and captured depots fed forward airstrips in Normandy and beyond. Mustangs hopping to ALG strips in France, with pierceable steel planking clattering under their wheels and fuel drums stacked like barricades. Mobility tasted of dust and petrol. A dozen ground crew shadowed each fighter. Crew chief, armourer, radio man, instrument specialist, engine men, resetting timing, re-rigging controls, and wiping exhaust streaks from silver skins before the next brief. Readiness had hands. The 8th Air Force scheduled escorts like trains, group to group, hour to hour. Hundreds of sorties layered by altitude, and timed so precisely that a navigator could pencil the moment little friends would appear over Merseburg and not be wrong. Precision became habit. Synthetic fuel plants at Luna, Buhlen, and Brex learned the meaning of repetition. Bombers arriving with fighter screens intact and leaving craters that bulldozers filled by night only to be opened again by noon. Pressure never slept. In 1944 alone the United States built over 96,000 military aircraft, with Liberty ships and C-54s carrying the spares, tools, and men to keep them in the air, as if the ocean were merely a wide conveyor. Distance dissolved under tonnage. German maintenance troops worked miracles in blast-scarred pens. But every miracle faced a daylight where Mustang rovers might arrive unannounced and turn a week's repair back into twisted metal in one pass. Recovery lost the day. Ammunition, fuel, tires, props, coolant, each a column on a ledger, converged into contrails above the Reich. And the arithmetic was remorseless. Sorties multiplied, while pilot pools shrank and octane dwindled to fumes. Numbers gained teeth. Factory output is nothing without trained men and fuel. A fighter operations note warned in late 1944, pragmatic and grim, as Staffel's briefed tactics that assumed interception under odds no longer favourable. Reality wrote doctrine. On assembly lines, rivet guns rattled, paint dried, inspectors stamped, and another P-51 rolled forward to be crated, shipped uncrated, test flown, armed, and sent to join the white braids over a target that would see them again tomorrow. Repetition became fate. And in that grinding cadence, steel from presses, engines from Detroit, fuel from tankers, pilots from schools. The Mustang's presence over Berlin read as the product of a nation in motion, an avalanche of steel that buried distances and doubts alike. Industry made the sky submit. In the years after the smoke lifted, veterans remembered the whiteness of that sky over Berlin. The braids of contrails laid down like chalk lines across a verdict no one could erase. Memory stayed cold. Combat reports yellowed in archives at Maxwell and Q, the tidy entries still stark. Escorted to target, engaged eager over Berlin. Claims submitted, losses as listed. Each line a quiet weight that outlasted engines. Paper kept voices. Hermann G.R. Ring's admission travelled farther than any order he ever gave. When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the war was lost. Hubris left a footprint. For German pilots, the end felt like a narrowing corridor. Fuel cut to dribbles. Training shortened to syllables. Veterans gone with no time to replace them. Until every climb meant exposure, and every exposure meant odds they could measure in funerals. Exhaustion became doctrine. Diaries from the Jagdwaff summer of 1944 turned clipped and grey. Verlust Shoah. Mustangs Überseelgebiet. Notes written by hands that had once sketched victory arrows and now only counted absences. Confidence fell silent. On the Allied side, the Mustang lived on as more than a silhouette. Its lines preserved in museums, where children listened to veterans' hands trace the laminar wing, and the radiator scoop like old cartographers naming coasts. Shape became story. At Dayton a blue-nosed P-51D marked, PT-sickened, stands under quiet lights, while at Duxford a yellow-tailed warbird named. Ferocious Frankie sometimes lifts into English summer to show the sound of a Packard Merlin at climb. History still flies. In glass cases the KO-14 gyro sight, and a tin of API rounds sit beside gun camera reels whose flicker turns black crosses and silver stars into brief white sparks that vanish as quickly as breath on a canopy. Evidence breathes. The Mustang's life did not end at Berlin. It reappeared in Korea, renamed F-51, carrying bombs and rockets low over frozen valleys because jets could not yet loiter where infantry bled. Relevance endured. Other flags claimed its outline. Sweden flew it as J-26 Israel, Australia, and the Dominican Republic kept it long after jets ruled the headlines. And each repainting of the aluminum skin carried the same promise of range and reach. Longevity spoke softly. Engineers remembered what the airframe had taught, the worth of efficient wings, of cooling that paid its own way, of fuel made into strategy, and they wrote those lessons into jets and doctrines that measured victory and tempo, not just thrust. Design became wisdom. Pilots spoke of it without ceremony, honest, forgiving. Would bring you home on one magneto and a prayer. Phrases you hear in hangars where oil smells like time and the floor is stained with old weather. Respect came plain. The price was never hidden. Memorial boards at Debden and Leiston carry names that do not answer roll call, and the casual lines in sortie logs, failed to return, still sound like doors that shut against the wind. Dominance carried loss. For all the arithmetic, the most profound change was psychological. The Luftwaffe's last sanctuary, its own sky, had been crossed by escorts that did not turn away, and that knowledge seeped down into bunkers and briefings until it lived behind every order. Fear travelled faster than fuel. The bomber stream, once a wager against a gauntlet, became a schedule kept by fighters who treated Berlin like a waypoint, and the rhythm of raids no longer rose and fell with hope, but rolled on with the impartial heft of industry. Inevitability had a sound. Post-war. Even adversaries found the same word, inevitable, written between the lines of memoir and analysis, because range is not a boast, but a boundary moved, and once moved it redraws everything it touches. Boundaries bled. That is why the P-51 left the war not only as metal and numbers, but as a symbol. Of a machine whose character met its moment, of a doctrine that chose offence over orbit, of an industrial thunder that could be heard in the quiet of a museum hall. Myth grew from fact. And if you stand beneath a Mustang today and look along its wing toward a distant wall, you can almost see a line reaching past the exhibit glass, across seas and rails and cities, to a blue noon where contrails braided and a capital realized it was no longer alone. Realization had a horizon. The Luftwaffe feared nothing in the sky until the PA-51 escorted bombers all the way to Berlin.